Why did it take the Toronto Police Services years to detect a serial killer operating in Toronto's gay village? That was among the key questions before the independent civilian review into missing person investigations led by former Judge Gloria Epstein. Mark Sandler was lead counsel for the review, and he joins us now on the findings of their final report, Missing and Missed. Hi, Mr. Sandler. It's nice to meet you. Let's start with some context. Why was an independent review into missing person cases launched in the first place?
Well, the community had very deep concerns about how a number of these high-profile missing persons cases had been conducted. Most prominent amongst them, the investigations into those who ultimately turned out to be the victims of Bruce McArthur. There were other high-profile cases, such as the disappearance of Alora Wells and also
Test
Tess
review?
Ritchie. And as a result of the concerns expressed by the LGBTQ2S plus community and other representatives of marginalized and vulnerable communities, it was decided that an independent review was necessary to address the issues.
So before, how were missing persons cases typically investigated?
Well, what Judge Epstein found was that low priority was given to the cases in many, many instances. There were exceptions, cases of young children going missing where Amber Alerts were issued and the like. But other than the very, very obvious cases, generally speaking, very low priority was given to these cases. And that was deeply unfortunate for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was that people who go missing are at risk of harm, as we know from these particular cases. And secondly, that those who go missing disproportionately come from marginalized and vulnerable communities. So you're dealing with a situation where the relationship between the Toronto Police and those communities is already frayed based upon a legacy of mistrust. And then you have these cases not being given the priority they deserve.
And I think for anybody, if your loved one goes missing and then you find out that the police deemed that low priority, because obviously for you, that's not a low priority. And that just makes it even worse. Like you mentioned with the trust, that gap just goes bigger, right?
Well, that's exactly right. So several things that you take from that. The first is that when you see that your loved one has gone missing, you report it, and you're told, for example, that a lead investigator is not going to be assigned for several days, that no press release is issued in relation to the case for several days, and that the investigative leads that you might expect are not being pursued, then the unfortunate message that that conveys is that the police don't care about your loved ones. And again, that exacerbates this mistrust that already exists amongst many members of the vulnerable and marginalized communities.
You mentioned Bruce McArthur, and I mentioned that in the opening. What mistakes were made in this case?
Well, if one goes through the history of the investigations that related to Bruce McArthur, you start with Mr. Navaratnam, who went missing in 2010. And his case was investigated, but it wasn't given any sort of priority. And what that meant is no proper risk assessment was done. The red flags that suggested that he was potentially the victim of foul play were not identified properly. His computer, even though it was taken, was never searched forensically for clues. And we know from later information that there were lots of clues that were contained in the computer, so that we saw low priority, low attention given to it. The case was handed from investigator to investigator, and many of the interviews that should have been done in the case were never done.
It's also
And
mentioned
then,
in the, sorry.
sorry, what I was going to say is, and that was just the start. And then Mr. Feisey goes missing, also from the gay village. His case was investigated by Peel, which did a better job at investigating his case. But when Peel saw the connection that potentially existed between Mr. Feisey's disappearance and Mr. Navaratnam's disappearance, Peel reached out to Toronto Police, but Peel was ignored. And as a result, the Toronto Police lost an important opportunity to see the links between these cases as early as 2010 and 2011. Then Mr. Cayenne goes missing, also from the gay village. So now you've got three men of color who are gay or bisexual who have gone missing from the gay village. And the investigator in Mr. Cayен's case was unaware of the other two cases. So he was operating within this siloed environment so that no connections were being made, or even potential connections being made at that point in time. So at the early stages, when three of these men went missing, there were a number of deficiencies in how they were being conducted. And Judge Epstein found that those deficiencies were explained by not only low priority generally to cases, but the fact that these were men from marginalized and vulnerable communities, and less attention was being given to their cases.
Well, that
And
is
then we
mentioned
moved.
in the report. That is mentioned in the report. And, you know, when you're saying, if people are listening to this and they're hearing when these three men had been missing, if the connections were made, all those other lives lost, all those other men that were killed could have been prevented. And in the report, it does mention that there was a perception from some in the LGBTQ plus community that because some of these victims weren't white, the police wasn't interested. Is that a fair conclusion to come to?
Well, it's a fair conclusion to come to that systemic discrimination explained a number of the inadequacies in these investigations. And systemic discrimination relates to a service's culture, its practices, its systems in place. And so you look at it and you don't ask yourself whether anybody intends to discriminate against marginalized or vulnerable people, but you ask yourself, are you set up for failure? Do your systems create an environment where these communities are disadvantaged? And Judge Epstein found that that's precisely what transpired here. And it wasn't just a situation that Mr. Kinsman, whose investigation was dealt with in a very different way, was white, and the others who were reported missing were not. It really had to do with who had the voice to make themselves heard. And Mr. Kinsman's supporters were very powerfully made the case for why his investigation deserved priority. And there was a lot of pressure that they put on the police, appropriately so. And there was also at that point internal pressure from some officers within the police service to say, we've got a very significant problem here and we haven't given it the attention it deserves. So what she finds is that systemic discrimination does explain part of what went wrong here, because the quality of an investigation should not depend on whose voice is the loudest. And
Well, to build
marginalized
on
and
to
right?
And to build on to what you're just saying, the report did say proper missing persons investigation should not depend on whose voices are the loudest or most empowered in sounding the alarm. Why was it important to include that?
Well, it was important to include that because if the systems that are in place allow differential treatment based upon who you are, then the system is fundamentally unfair. And you have to start with an understanding of the legacy of distrust that currently exists. Many members of marginalized and vulnerable communities have been the victims of over-policing and under-servicing. And so what the Toronto service has to do is ensure that that is not perpetuated going forward. So missing persons is just an example of situations in which marginalized and vulnerable community members were receiving differential treatment, not merely in the quality of the investigations, but also in the extent to which communities were allowed to be involved in these investigations, were asked to contribute to them, knew about them. And on so many levels, these investigations fell below appropriate standards.
You also mentioned Tess Ritchie. This was a young woman who went missing in 2017. What mistakes were made in her case?
Well, as you probably know, when she disappeared, the police conducted a search of the area again in the gay village to see whether they could find her. Unfortunately, it was her own mother who discovered her body not far, as actually 80 meters away from where she had last been seen. So no proper search was done as was required of the area in close proximity to where she was last seen. That was a very significant error as well. We saw that there was a delay in appointing a lead investigator on the case. There was a delay in seeking out video footage in the area nearby where she had gone missing. We saw that when her body was discovered, the homicide squad was not notified, even though this was a case that raised concerns about suspicion. And as we know, ultimately someone was charged with murder. So there were a whole series of issues associated with Tess Ritchie's disappearance, the most prominent being the failure to conduct a search where it should have been conducted.
I can't even imagine the nightmare of a mother finding their own child. What could have police have done differently here?
Well, if you're talking specifically about her case or more
Yeah,
generally,
with Tess.
on Tess Ritchie's case, what should have happened is that when the police learned that she had last been seen at a particular location, which was new information that they obtained during the investigation, then they should have conducted a further search in the area that was in close proximity to where she was last seen. And they should have sought out video footage at the very earliest opportunities of the investigation, because often the video footage from nearby businesses and in some instances homes represents the best evidence as to what has happened to someone. And we know that because it was video footage that led to the apprehension of Mr. McArthur. And we know that video footage also figured prominently in the prosecution of Mr. Schlatter for Ms. Ritchie's murder.
And I don't know what you can say to her family to say why that wasn't done in the first place.
Well, I think Judge Epstein has said everything that can be said about why that wasn't done. She has set out a series of issues, both in the existing procedures at the time, in the practices at the time, as I've said, in the low priority given to these cases, in the failure to assign investigators in a timely way. And Judge Epstein has also spoken to the family on several occasions as well. So I think they've got a good sense of what went wrong in the case based upon the report.
You also mentioned Alora Wells, and she was an Indigenous trans woman who also went missing in 2017. What happened with her case?
Well, her case might be a microcosm of the systemic failures that we saw across the board. And by that, I mean this. Her unidentified remains were discovered in the Rosedale Valley ravine. And an officer was assigned, again, several days after the fact, to determine what had happened to this person, as yet unidentified. And it was pretty obvious, based upon the information that was available to the police, that this person was a trans woman, someone with Indigenous heritage, potentially someone who had been involved as a sex worker and involved in drug use. And we knew that from both the forensic evidence that had been collected at the scene and from the examination of her remains. But what happened was that police took months to figure out that this was Alora Wells. And one of the reasons that that happened was that the officer, although well-meaning, was unaware of the resources available in the community to assist in identifying this woman. And when you think about it, here's a trans woman with Indigenous background who may be involved in sex trade and also in drug use. It wasn't a difficult connection for the community in the know to make if anybody had reached out to the community with this information. But no press release was issued in a timely way. The community resources and organizations were never drawn upon to provide information. And when I say this is a microcosm of what we saw across the board, we saw the underutilizing of community to assist in solving the disappearances of people from marginalized and vulnerable communities. This is a theme of Judge Epstein's report. So that was one of the issues. The second issue was that when Alora Wells's father did report his daughter missing, initially a missing persons report was not even taken. And he regarded that as a reflection of the fact that she was being treated as if she was a nobody. In other words, that her marginalization and vulnerability, which is not the way he would express it, was being manifested in the way his missing persons report was being evaluated by the police. And the third, when he contacted the chief coroner's office, as did the police, to be told that there's nobody who meets the description of his daughter who is sitting in the morgue, that was just misinformation. And so that represented another systemic failure, the failure to connect unidentified remains that are sitting in the morgue with reports of those who have gone missing. And then superimposed on all of that, if that's not enough, is that because she came from the trans community, Judge Epstein dealt with the particular vulnerabilities of that community and the particularly frayed relationship that exists between the trans community and the Toronto police. So we had a lot to talk about in relation to her case.
And again, that what you said a few times is the trust. Is there, I read that Judge Epstein said that this going through these cases really impacted her. How did it impact her?
Well, she met so many members of the community. Our attitude was anyone who wants to meet with us, we were going to meet with. And we fulfilled that pledge. Nobody was turned down. And we met with them in their own safe and supportive environments rather than bringing them to an office, a lawyer's office. And it really moved Judge Epstein, as it did me, to hear their stories and lived experiences in dealing with the Toronto police, in dealing with the disappearances of their loved ones, and even those who did not have persons missing from their families, also described the way in which the police interact with them. And it was just so obvious that so much work has yet to be done to repair that relationship. So Judge Epstein said in her press conference that she wished she had met all of these people before she served as a judge for 25 years rather than after, because
Why?
she thinks it would have made her a better judge, and she was a pretty good judge indeed. So that's something.
Well, the Toronto Police Services has pledged to make changes, and there are 151 recommendations in this report. If you had to identify the most significant recommendations, what would they be?
So before I answer that, I should just say that we were encouraged by the fact that Chief Raymer, as well as
The
the
interim
chair of
chief?
the Toronto, the interim chief, as
Mhm.
well as the chair of the Toronto Police Services Board, committed themselves to implementing all 151 recommendations. That was an important thing to say. And of course, it has to come with measurable outcomes and timelines that we've identified in the report, but that was a good start. If I had to identify the most important recommendations out of the 151, not an easy task, I think I would identify the model that Judge Epstein proposes for missing persons investigations going forward. And the model would make Toronto a leader globally in how missing person investigations are conducted. And what it contemplates is robust triaging of these cases because so many of them don't involve criminal law issues, but involve social issues. So the goal is to ensure that these cases are responded to in an appropriate way. In many instances, that will mean that the response should come from public health, social service agencies, community agencies, not-for-profits. In some instances, it should come from the Toronto Police, especially in situations where foul play is suspected or the person is at risk of harm while out in the community. and some through a combination of police working in partnership with community and these agencies. So what the report advocates for is a midterm and a long-term model that robustly triages these cases, moves a number of them into non-policing responses, engages preventative strategies so that people don't feel that they have to leave their environments in some circumstances, so that you address their social issues. And it also involves the introduction of far more civilians involved in the process rather than sworn uniform officers. That's probably the most significant out of the many recommendations that have been made. We've also tried to build a model so that policing will be regarded as a profession, which means education and training that focuses not just on the technical requirements for officers, but on cultural humility, on judgment, on building relations, on exercising good judgment. In other words, the things that are sometimes thought of as secondary, but are really critical if police are going to be involved in this holistic approach to community safety and well-being.
How do you do that, though?
Well, you do it in a variety of ways. There are some exciting initiatives that exist, and in fairness, the Toronto Police have introduced some initiatives in this area already to reimagine how officers are trained and educated. It involves greater use of neighborhood liaison officers, which is a program that is successful within the Toronto Police Service. It involves greater use of liaison officers within the service and in all divisions in order to build relationships with the community and make it the responsibility of every officer to build relations with marginalized and vulnerable communities. It involves a reimagining, which is a term that we use several times in the report, a reimagining of how community consultation takes place, because there is a tendency just to create a new committee every time an issue takes place, as opposed to a more holistic approach that recognizes the intersectionality of issues. In other words, people in the community are not simply defined by the fact that they're Black, or defined by the fact that they're Indigenous, or the fact that they're trans. There's an intersection of personal identifiers that play such an important role in how they're dealt with by the police. So Judge Epstein has made a series of recommendations that involve renewal of how community consultation takes place.
Um, Mark Sandler, thank you so much for your time, and our thanks to Judge Epstein as well. This was a difficult conversation to have, but very important. And I recommend, if anyone is interested, to look it up and to learn more. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your
Thank
insight.
you. Okay.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.